All good? Okay. So I want to start off by saying that in the spirit of reconciliation, the Statistical Society of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present in this meeting today. So welcome and thank you everyone for coming to this joint meeting between ABS and SSA Canberra. My name is Francis. I'm the current president of the Canberra branch of the Stats Society of Australia. And I'll be chairing today's meeting. And today it is a great honour to have the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics Chief Methodologist, Anders Holmberg, speak to us as our Foreman lecturer. Now, just before I introduce Anders, I just want to give a little spiel, as I typically do at the beginning of these meetings nowadays. For those who are just unaware, the Statistical Society of Australia is the national body that represents statisticians and data scientists from all across the country. And if you want to know more about events, workshops, meetings, and all that cool stuff that takes place both nationally and in your local state and territory, then you can visit StatSoc or www.statsoc.org.au to find out more. I should also mention particularly because this is a joint meeting with ABS, SSA Canberra in particular is looking to strengthen our relationship with the ABS through more joint events of mutual interest, as well as more general communication. And also for trying to find out what Stats Society as a whole, both the Canberra branch and more generally, can potentially offer to the ABS. So if you're part of the ABS and you want to get involved, become an SSA member, and want to contribute back to the ACT and also more to the national community of statisticians and data scientists, please get in touch. And at the Canberra branch level, you can do that via ssaccanberra@gmail.com. Okay, so so the next bit is I'll have a little bit of housekeeping, which is basically that as per usual, if you are not speaking, please please ensure your microphone is muted, just to try and minimize any sort of feedback. And in terms of handling questions, I think maybe the best option is actually we sort of do the questions at the end after Anders' talk. And generally speaking, actually, to be honest, whether you do it via a raise hand option or whether you do it via the chat, I'll try and do my best to juggle both, and I'll sort of pass those questions on to Anders after he speaks. Okay, so today's speaker, as mentioned, is Dr. Anders Holmberg, who is the current Chief Methodologist and General Manager of the Methodology Division at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, having taken up that role in September 2019. He has a background in various types of data sources for official statistics in many countries, including Sweden, Cambodia, New Zealand, and Norway, and has expertise with the design and collection of sample survey data, use of multiple administrative data sources and population census, and administrative data about people, businesses, and properties for statistical and research purposes. And today he's going to be talking about what is the difference and does it matter, reflections on how the methodology work in official statistics relates among countries and on the Australian opportunities therein. So I will share my screen and pass it over to Anders.
Thank you, Francis. And I'll just like to echo what you said. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community that might be listening or sitting in on this webinar. I just want to say before we begin, we also have a brave audience here in the NIBS auditorium. So there will be opportunities for you as well to ask questions. So we'll see which order we take it once we get there. So once again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to give the Foreman lecture. Originally, I think Francis and I planned to do this seminar in April, but other things came in between. And at least there is 5 people in the audience here, and including myself. So we are a little bit more back to normal in some sense. It's been very interesting and a humbling experience for me to read up and get the chance to study more about the person who's meant a lot for the Australian official statistics. My talk will be about the methodology work that I've seen, and from where we can, from some reflections on my experience on what we can improve and work on in the Australian context. And Having said that, there is another side of that coin, and that's of course things that we shouldn't imitate or benchmark or take after, but I'll save that for internal consultations, because I don't think it's suitable to say all those things in a public seminar like this. Another thing would be, of course, to talk about what Australia has to learn others, but that's also a completely different seminar, and should be given to another audience than this one. So next slide, please, Francis. So my outline of this seminar will be the following. I'll begin with a few thoughts that I've read up about Ken Foreman and the era he represents and how that aligns to or relates to my experiences. I will continue by giving a brief context of the methodological work at the National Statistical Office, and I hope it will be enough for you guys who haven't worked in the National Statistical Office to understand the context on methodology in that, and also giving my background to the reflections I've done. The core of the talk will be the questions in the title, and I will try to exemplify by various environments and circumstances that I've gone through. And it might require a little bit of knowledge about methodology work, but I hope that I will be able to explain that in layman terms, and otherwise we'll just bring it up in the discussion afterwards. I should also mention that some of these illustrations that I've made a deliberate cutoff that it is based on places where I've been working for 1.5 years, which means that you won't see any Australian flags in there, but I will give you my opinion where I believe that we sit in this international comparisons. But again, it's speculation to a large degree. It's a bit of artisan scales as well, but I hope it will at least spark a bit of a discussion later on. Next slide, please. So Ken Foreman and his contribution to methodology, statistical methodology in Australia, and who he was and why he's remembered so affectionately. I'm in gratitude to Daniel Elisar in my division, who gave me some of the parts to present these pictures of Ken. I'm also in debt to Lyndon Ang in my division, who managed to save one of Ken's, a copy of Ken's book, Survey Sampling Principles, that came out in 1991. So thank you, guys. It's now been 25 years since Ken died, but his name is still very, very much present in ABS. So every year my division is given the Ken Foreman Award, and that is given to a prominent member of the ABS who's done good methodology work during a year. And the prize is usually a trip or some other kinds of gratitudes in terms of education and training and so on and so forth. I have to admit, though, that I didn't even know that this book existed before I read up about Ken Foreman. And the reason, for those of you who are survey sampling statistician and realizes that since I'm Swedish, I would have used the survey sampling book by Svensson and Wretman instead. And that's what I kind of grew up with, and so on and so forth. And it's not until I think now that I saw that there are a number of books that came out here in the early 90s that actually picks up the survey methodology in part. And reading through the survey sampling principle, I have to say it would have been very useful for me when I was in Cambodia, because it has a cookbook approach that would have been nice to look up things while I was working there. But if you were asked me hand on heart, I would still use my yellow one. That would be my go-to Bible in a sense. So who was Ken and what did he do? Well, he was born in 1923. There's a picture of an airplane here, and apparently he joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1943. He got shot down over Germany in 1945. I think it was Germany. I'm not sure, actually. It just says Lancaster. I just assumed it was Germany. It might be in Japan. That could be something that we can look into later. And he was badly injured. But he recovered, and he came back, and he started a career in Australian Bureau of Statistics. In 1952, he went to the US Census Bureau, and this was a very, let's say, lively time for survey sampling. So they had renowned names like Morris Henson, who was the chief there for a long time, and W. Edward Deming, who later became mostly known for quality control and quality management. But he studied under them and came back to Australia in the early 50s. And it said in his obituary that immediately on his return to Canberra, he was set to task of designing a sample of income taxpayers to replace a complete enumeration that was done up till then. And he went through with that, and that enabled the tax office to abolish 80 positions by using sampling and surveys instead. And it made created also 5 new jobs at the then called sampling section, where Ken was becoming his head. He was also a mastermind and have done a lot of things that I suppose we today who work with methodology in national statistical offices take for granted, not just the sampling and survey parts, but also work within seasonal adjustments and other comprehensive training. I think when I asked about the book, I was told that, you can go through the statistical methods 1, and a lot of the things in there is actually Ken's work and comes from the book as well. So as I said, it's been a humbling experience to read about this, and there's a number of papers as well that the Society put up about Ken, and he also played an important role for 2 former Australian statisticians. I think Dennis Truman was on the call here. He was one of them that is mentioned in the book here, and it's been mentioned in other parts. For me, though, there was another Ken, the kind of closest the circle to Ken Foreman. So I was introduced to Ken Brewer, another Australian statistician that worked for the ABS, and I got introduced to him by Phil Cott, the American. And when I was writing my thesis, I got a very vivid and fascinating email correspondence with Ken Brewer, and I was kind of overwhelmed in the sense that Ken Brewer responded to my emails and so on. And while reading these things, I also got, which I didn't know on beforehand, I got the information that it was Ken Foreman who helped Ken Brewer to publish a paper in the Australian Journal of Statistics in 1963 that actually brought on using models in survey sampling. And this was kind of, I wouldn't say new, but it was, a bit unorthodox at the time. And the nice thing about that is that was exactly the paper and the work that followed that sort of influenced me in some of my work in my thesis. Another thing that struck me is that Ken Foreman played a role here in Australia that is similar to what my academic grandfather Tore Dallenius did in Sweden. So they both went over to the US in the late 40s, early 50s, brought back home survey sampling theory and made that, implemented that in an environment that basically was, total enumerations and pretty crude methods. So it's interesting to see those connections. I'll come back to Tore more later if I have the time. But reading the paper by Ken Brewer describing Ken Foreman as a supervisor as kindly but exacting is another similarity which my supervisor Bengt Svensson used to say about Tore. Ken Brewer also says infuriatingly exacting, and I would say that probably that's the way my supervisor described Tore Dallenius to a certain extent. And I think that it makes you think, right? Because it's these are people that sadly passed away quite recently, but their legacy still, their legacy and their supervisors, Ken Foreman and Tore's legacy is still alive, and that makes you, that's part of making me humble to, giving this talk, and also I think all of us have these people a lot to thank for where we are today. So next slide, please. So what's methodology in a statistical agency, and what do methodologists do in a statistical agency? I once met a professor that came from academia and started working at Statistics Sweden, and after a few weeks he came into my room and he said, well, you know, this is like being a kid in a toy store, because suddenly he got to work with practical cases. He got to work with so many problems where he actually could apply all his theory that he had been studying at the university for a long time. And I think it's a good thing that I tend to come back to that part, because I think it's a good description, because it relates to my own development as well. I started off coming from the university, finished my PhD at Statistics Sweden, and if you're curious, there is a lot of things that you can do as a methodologist at a statistical agency. There's a lot of areas. Obviously, the area where Foreman was maybe most known, the survey sampling, survey methodology area. There are other things like questionnaire design, collection technology, processing estimation, time series, seasonal adjustment, integrating multiple sources is another one thing that's been coming and growing more and more lately. I think also as a methodologist, working around index theory is something that people like. Well, there's a whole heaps of things that you can do. I would actually add also enhancing things with statistical software. There's a lot of coding excellence that comes with methodologists in a statistical agency. And also a fair bit of what we today call data science and visualization is also pieces that sits within methodology. And if you go around the world and look how things are organized, you also might find standards and classifications sometimes. Sometimes you'll find geospatial parts. You know, you'll find these, for a statistical agency, necessary but a little bit small and odd specialities that they need to be placed somewhere, and they often, or sometimes at least, end up in methodology units and methodology sections. And that's another one of my reflections going back, that, you know, once you get those things in there, you get a completely different development of those areas, but also of methodology in a sense. Okay. I think that just to give you a brief description also how the methodology division today is organized, might not make sense for all of you, but it's kind of also tells a bit what we do. So we do have 9 sections in total. We have respondent and collection methodology. We have business statistics methodology, household statistics methodology, macroeconomic statistics methodology, and all of these are more or less, you know, supporting those area of the ABS today and the business for ABS. We also have a more of a research part, although there are support parts in that too, and that's data access and confidentiality. There is one section called methodology futures that looks into machine learning on the other areas. Another one is called machine intelligence and novel data science, called MINDS, which also looks a bit at machine learning, but also looks perhaps more from the data science technology point of view rather than the statistical point of view, which is more for methodology futures. And there is a data linking methodology. I'm looking at Daniel Elisar, who's in the audience here today, and another one about data confidentiality. I think that's all the 9 sections that we have today. And what do they do and why do they do it? I kind of tried to summarize this in the slide that I've had up here. So I think they also need to be connected. So the biggest part of the methodology work, that would be around the support part, supporting other parts of the organization. Training, special tasks, expert tasks in that sense, but also being ready to quality assure and audit and fix things if things go wrong. That is closely linked to the one I call develop and implement. And my way of seeing that is that we kind of know what we need to do. We just don't know exactly how it's going to be implemented. So we need to develop some special adaptation to get it working within the production systems that we have. It's an area that is dependent, I think, on a good training and good feeding and good knowledge of what is needed inside the production environment. And especially it's a bit about finding things that actually works in practice. It's not necessarily the most best theory that you would use, but it's something that you would translate the theory into something that is defensible in a way. The third part here would be around research and innovation. And here is where we need to have our ear against the rails, basically, to see what's going on, but also doing things that are fit for purpose for statistical production. So I once said that I know that the 3M is already a stolen trademark, so we can't use it for methodology, but I think that a good methodologist, that would be somebody that is very good at modernizing the environment to make more cost-efficient statistics. It would be somebody who's good at moderating theoretical development into a practical environment to make fit-for-purpose solutions. And it would also be somebody that is mandating. That's the third M. So saying that this is actually an authorized solution that would work and be defended and could kind of give us the trust in the statistics that we need. Next slide, please. So within official statistics, there's been, as long as I've been working in it, it's kind of been two parallel demands and business streams. And I don't know if this picture will be self-explanatory. So I'll say a few things what I mean by that. And basically what I'm meaning is that you have the traditional approach in a sense, which is where you collect the data or acquire the data for the statistical purposes. And this will be the bulk of what's going on in official statistics. It would be surveys, censuses, a little bit of experiments. Most of the time, the experiments are done in-house. It's very seldom that a statistical agency goes out and makes an experiment on people in the public or businesses in the public. It happens once in a while. I've been lucky to do one of them, but they're very seldom hard. They're often very hard to organize. A third one here would be for the purpose of validation and audit. And a typical example of that will be the post-enumeration survey, where we try to improve population estimates. When we did when I was involved in the first Swedish register-based census, we actually called people to also check whether the household was what it said in the register, which was a bit controversial in a way, because you're calling up people or you're trying to contact people to see, according to our register, it says here that you live with this and this person. Is that true? So that's another example of things that you can do to sort of validate an original source. This goes through, and I think that in the past years, it's been various business statistical production models that sort of are tailored from this point of view, that you know your need, you know what your output is going to be, and you organize and design your collection for that. But parallel to this, there's been a long history also of using or recycling data, or using the second life, or what I call here the third life of data even. And this is something that's it's been around for a long time. The very first national census, the Swedish-Finnish one in 1749, was using church books, which was basically administrative data used to, I don't know, control that people had the right religion back then, but it's something that was reused to make a count of the people. And today, I think for many different reasons, for technology reasons and for other reasons, such as cost pressures on statistical agency, it has made sense to start looking at already existing data to see, can we make the statistics that we want with those data? And this is a different business model to a certain extent, because you're kind of making yourself dependent on somebody else and somebody else's some other purpose, then you really go after, and that would naturally lead to other problems, such as is the concepts the ones I'm looking for? What kind of methodological solutions do you need to come up with to use this second best data to produce the statistics that you do? And another thing, of course, often if you look at these, what they today call big data, sensors and other things, they're often thin. They're missing something. There are a lot of records, a lot of observations and so on, but it might not have the concepts that you're looking for, which means that they might have to be integrated with something else. And that's another one of these business trenches that is happening. And both of these kind of in sources or inflows, they can be used for classical statistics, but there's also an increased demand, I would say, for national statistics offices to provide and share and make data useful for other things such as analytics and research, confirmatory and exploratory, and all these kinds of things that the society actually needs. And this is evolving all the time, and a methodology division or unit and section needs to be prepared for these questions that comes around the corner. So that's kind of giving a little bit of the background. So what I'm going to do now is to move into a little bit speculation and reflections about where we might be heading in Australia if we benchmark and pick up some of the good examples that I've seen and use the trends that, well, trend is a hard word here, but at least the signals and the demands that comes towards the official statistical system. I will not go deep into the methodological program. I won't deep dive into that, but I will give some general directions and point to some areas where I think that we would or should and also could do a lot of work, and especially pick up something that we don't need to reinvent. And having said that, I also have to give my acknowledgement to my predecessors here at the ABS and in the methodology division, because they actually worked on these things for a long time. So I think we're in a pretty good position to just pick up and continue to develop some of these things. And I'd like to highlight a few things that struck me when I came here, which actually makes us in this good position. I'd like to highlight the work that many people in the ABS, but particularly some people in MD, was involved in creating these data integration systems like MADIP and BLADE, because I'm going to come back to how they might be further utilized and developed later on. Preparatory work in big data, trying to figure out the theoretical underpinnings of it and how it can be used, integrating it with other types of data, how it could be taken care of when it's brought into the production systems, is another area where I like to highlight the good work that's been done by people in MD and my predecessors. Machine learning is another one. And one of the things I'm really going to highlight here and bring to its core is use of auxiliary data, basically, use of other sources to complement or strengthen an already existing main source. So those are a few things that I will be picking up from my example. So next slide, please. So here is a bit of my career. I started off at Statistics Sweden in the mid-1999. That's the past century. It sounds even further ago, but I came in and I had a few years left to work on my PhD thesis, and I worked in an R&D department. So I was hired as number 3 for 2 positions. So somebody took a chance on me. That was Lars Lyberg, that some of you might know. And I'm happy for that, because I had 2 interviews at the same time. So one was at University Hospital to help the doctors with statistical analysis and so on. And the other one was at Statistics Sweden. I got the job I wanted, mainly because my supervisor was a survey specialist, and it looked like intriguing. This R&D department, however, was a bit of a interesting school, because they had some really brilliant people, but it was also a central department that had issues collaborating with other departments, because they were seen as a bit of busybodies, and they were working on internal problems and a little bit of ivory tower. And me and my other two younger colleagues, we were tasked with a task to try to improve the image of the R&D. So we were sent out more or less like novices or SWAT teams to go out and help people with methodological problems. And that was, in retrospect, I find that it was a very, very good, school to be in. On the other hand, it was a bit of a gamble, because we didn't really know much on how things worked in practice. I had that yellow book, and I had a few other things and some common sense, but that was what we were armed with at that time. I think if I look back on my time in Sweden and what's relevant for the talk today, that would be heading up the methodology part of the register-based census. Other things that I think would be useful for the topic I'm talking about today, that would be also making sure that we brought in undergraduate summer students and recruited them into Statistics Sweden. So those are the two pieces I would probably pick as relevant for this. It was a turbulent time, so I kind of became chief methodologist, or director of methodology as it was called, and it was reorganizations and things like that. And I worked as that for a few years, various types of modernization programs and so on. And one day when I was, traveling back and forth between the two sites, and somebody called me in the corridor and said, or actually I asked, how is it going with that position in Cambodia? And they say, we haven't filled it. Or maybe I should apply, I said to the guy. I walked home, and the morning after, the head of the international relations unit called me and asked me, were you serious? We're willing to offer you this time for 1.5 years in Cambodia. And I, at that time, thought I was still a statistician, in the sense that I would, work with practical parts. So I said yes, and we spent 1.5 years in Cambodia, which I'm not going to talk that much about here, but I don't regret it. I think it was a very good learning experience. And I basically worked end to end in a developing country with a household survey. It was called the Cambodian Socioeconomic Survey. It collected everything from inputs to the national accounts to violence in the homes and all these kinds of things, and having to work with setting up a sample scheme and a collection scheme, taking into account the rain season and all these kinds of things. And it was quite an experience. I don't think I would do it again, though, because also putting up and putting together the sampling frame by yourself in an Excel sheet while the power goes out and all these kinds of things, and you have a few hours to do it, that was not a pleasant thing. And to people in my division, I used to say that, I was there to train people so that the Cambodians can run it themselves, and I did. I don't think that they are running it themselves today, though. So in that sense, I think the whole project in a way failed. But I did a few good things, I think. One of them was making sure that every village in the survey had a geo coordinate. And the reason I came up with that, I thought, brilliant idea was that I had seen these international researchers coming by trying to use our data together with census data and other kinds of things. And these villages, they change name, they disappear, they come up. So they spent about 70% of their 70% of their time and their money on just cleaning data. And we're talking high profile statisticians. Stephen Haslett in New Zealand, for example, was one of those that worked on those things, who I met there. The other good thing I might have put forward was to make sure that the questionnaire didn't force the interviewers, or enumerators as they were called, to actually count sex of all the animals in the farms that they were visiting. So they were doing things like trying to estimate the number of female ducks and male ducks and so on. And you can imagine that, you know, if you're really serious with your work, they spent a lot of time in it. So those were a few of the things there. But I might come back a little bit to Cambodia. I don't think that Australia or ABS have much to learn, but I have one example at the end. From Cambodia, I went to Statistics New Zealand, and I think that the reason I ended up there was that I had worked with administrative data quite a lot, and I had 2 years there working as principal statisticians, which meant that it was a great time, especially since you don't have any staff, and you can think and you can help and you can come up with ideas, but you don't necessarily have to be responsible for them being pursued completely. So I really enjoyed New Zealand. It was a wonderful time and very educating as well, in the sense of how a statistical system outside the European statistical system actually works. And we did a whole heaps of good things. And one of the things I was involved in was that they were already then doing what they call the admin census. So they were doing preparatory work to modernize their census back in 2013, 14, 15, and so on. And thanks to people like Christine Bycroft and others, that work was well invested work, because when New Zealand had problems with their census, I think 2 years ago, they actually were able to pick it up and use those work that they had done to transform the census and implement some of the solutions and come up with results. Norway was my next one, and during the previous times I had been on leave from Stats Sweden, so I went to Norway. I resigned from Statistics Sweden, and we lived in Norway, me and my family, for about 4 years. And I had a position as chief methodologist there. I'll come back a little bit more, because there are some learnings from Norway that I like to recapitulate here. And I think that the main thing that struck me coming to Norway was to make sure that basically strengthening the methodology environment, because both in New Zealand and in Sweden, it was far stronger than it was in Norway. I was a bit surprised. They have at Statistics Norway one genius that solves a lot of things. He was supposed to be the Foreman lecturer this year in the conference. I hope we'll be able to take him over here. I'm talking about Li Chang, and then they have a lot of other people who are good workers, but they were not at that point of time very influential in how methodology was being done at Statistics Norway. Next slide, please. Sorry. So this is basically the few areas I've been working in, and I think you can go to next slide, Francis. I think I said most of the things there. So now to my reflections. What are the factors that kind of influences a statistical agency, but thereby also the methodology work in a statistical agency? So what I'm trying to do here is to put two axes here. One is high trust in government. The other one is high trust in official statistics. And they have the property of, being slow, going upwards and to the right, but they can move quite fast to the left if things go wrong. And I do rank the countries in a sense by putting these flags up here. And I do remember one of the things, the reason I put New Zealand higher than Sweden is that I recalled from an international survey back there when we were working on this admin census that the trust in government was very high, and we looked at the different countries that used administrative data for censuses. a lot more, and that's one of the reasons why New Zealand at that point of time really went through and had these big projects around using administrative sources for their statistics. The Norwegian case, on the other hand, was quite remarkable. They have a very, as a Swede, it was quite amazing to see that they have a very loyal and proud attitude to everything that's coming through the welfare state systems. And I think for those of you who are interested, study the Norwegian response to the terrorist attack that happened a few years ago. It's an extremely interesting case to see how a nation actually corrals around government systems and doing things in a very civilized and good way. And another fascinating thing that I found being at Statistics Norway was their high profile in the public debate. And I think partly that was because they had, I wouldn't say that we should, I definitely would not recommend to take after this, but they did have a research department there that was often out there in the media talking about the researchers' findings and so on. And I think that it kind of enhances the role of Statistics Norway in the public debate, and it gave them a good resume. And I think another explanation why I'll put them up there is that Norway still is a very regulated, highly regulated country. They're not part of the European Union. They're following all the European Union rules, but they are through the EFTA system and the ESS agreement. And I think that Statistics Norway still produces productivity measures that guides central salary negotiations and so on in the country. So they're very much trusted in those areas. And again, when I was there, it was quite turbulent time. So their director general had to resign, not having the confidence of the finance minister. But even in those times, even in those pretty turbulent times, the trust in Statistics Norway was unhurt basically, and it was really an interesting thing to see. I would say also that both Statistics New Zealand and Statistics Sweden are highly trusted, but not in the same magnitude as Norway. So where would I then put Australia? And here comes the first, I think, advantage of being in NIBS today, because I have one of these pointers. So I'll try to explain. It would definitely be in the top right quadrant of this picture. I would possibly, on the vertical axis, put it a little bit lower than the Swedish flag. That the trust in the government, I've read about the stories about the Australia card and all these kinds of things and so on. I would say it's high trust, but not as high trust as the other three countries that you have in that quadrant. On the high trust in official statistics, on the other hand, I would put them actually to the right of the Norwegian flag. So somewhere there would probably be the Australian flag in this picture. And the reason I feel confident in saying so is that the ABS made a community trust survey about trust in statistics during the first wave of the coronavirus outbreak. And the numbers there, to me, coming from these other countries, was mind-boggling. I was quite nervous going out and doing this collection and asking the public about trust during this particular period. It turns out that the way the ABS, I think partly because the ABS handled the first part of the coronavirus outbreak very well, we ended up with trust in as high as 85% of those responding trust or highly trust the ABS, and that's up from 76% back in 2015. Among informed users, there was 100%. So this is 150 or something journalists and others that also are asked the question about how they trust the ABS. And 100% is just a fantastic result, I have to say. There was also very high numbers on questions about trust in statistics. They were a little lower. but they were still remarkably high. And they were also much, much higher than the Reserve Bank, higher than ABC, and higher than many of the other local and state government parts. So definitely an Australian flag would be the furthest one to the right in this picture, I think, but a little lower perhaps on trust in government. Next slide, please. So another one of these things is how the national statistical systems and their national NSO, the national statistical organizations, acquire and collect their data. And this is definitely a factor that would influence methodology a lot more. This is, I have two axes, one centralized and one decentralized. And I have traditional data acquisition and modern data acquisition. And I would say that the Swedish system is extremely decentralized. The Norwegian one is very centralized, and the New Zealand one is even more centralized than that. And it comes to who makes the statistics in the country. In Sweden, it's a bit tough because the money bag often sits with other agencies, and Statistics Sweden has to pick up the contract every time a statistics is being done. Where we would put the Australian flag here? Well, it would be a little less centralized given that we have state and other territories. And it would be probably about the same place as New Zealand in terms of traditional versus modern data acquisition. Although with the introduction of the single touch payroll and that data, I would say we would be a bit further to the right compared to New Zealand, but left of the Norwegian one. Next slide, please. So here are a few things that I've discovered definitely differs the way the methodology is being put up. One of them is the population census. Sweden and Norway have register-based censuses, very well advanced administrative system that are used. Australia and New Zealand and Cambodia, for that matter, they have a traditional census. This reflects, or this gives you an interesting piece of where methodology needs to, allocate its resources. Data linking and integration is another one of these things that definitely differ between these organizations. In the Scandinavian countries, there are usually identifiers that you can use. There are no such things in New Zealand, for example. Confidential and disclosure control methods are very similar in the way things are spread and disseminated, but legislation and other things and sharing of data changes the way and the concentration of it. The sample selections are done in different ways as well, not just the methods, but the way and where and whether methodologists do it or not is different. Business surveys are also done in a different way. The business registers are handled differently. The way the methodologists are involved in creating and using the business register vary. In Sweden, for example, they're involved in the coordinating sampling and do everything. They coordinate all business surveys once. Here we do it, we once a year from a version, and then we continue from there. Here in Australia, there are other ways of doing it where we select new ones more frequently during the year. In Norway, you select it, every business survey has its own, which makes it really, really hard to coordinate the samples and make provider burden controlled in a sense. The last one I want to mention a little bit more is the labor force survey and the labor market statistics. So next slide, please. This is a scary picture. The non-response is another one of these things that methodologists often are involved in. And this is the Swedish labor force survey and the increase of the non-response that you can see happening from, I think, the 2008 and onwards. Somewhere here, you have a massive increase. There are explanations for this. One of them is that the then liberal conservative government decided to boost the sample size of the labor force survey and bring in people that are prone to be unemployed. Basically, immigrant boys in their young ages and living in urban areas. So I think that partly explains this. Another one is technology environment. So in Sweden, everyone is selected as persons. So you select people from the population register, which means that you need to find the exact that person, and that's done by telephone. So you have a whole heaps of things here which are non-context, which is completely different on how the labor force survey is collected, the data for the labor force survey is collected in other countries. You might think that Norway is the same. And I thought so when I got there, but it's not. So they select families from their population register and then try to collect those through telephone. And I was mind-boggled by the Norwegians had so low non-response. Their non-response was around 20% or something like this. This one points at almost 50. And all of you who are statistician knows it's not this number that matters. It's actually who is not responding that matters. And the thing with the Scandinavian countries is that they do have all these registers. They know a lot about the selected people from the start, so they can actually compensate some of this. I don't think they can compensate it all, but they can compensate some of it. And in Norway and Sweden, also this was done differently. And that was a bit surprising for me coming in there and seeing that, first of all, the Norwegians kind of cheated because they only counted households and it was mandatory. In Sweden, it's voluntary. I think it's mandatory here in Australia to answer the labor force survey. So there's all these different things that makes these things not extremely comparable, but they would still make a difference on how the methodology tradition and how methodologies work. Next slide, please. So here is another one of these things. My reflections on the strength of the methodology environment. I would definitely say that the Australian one would probably cover the top right corner of the Swedish flag here. We are stronger here in Australia than we were in the methodology in Sweden. We are more, but we also have a more stronger tradition, I think, and a better organization. It's central. In Sweden, it used to be decentralized, and that, in a sense, was not working very well. But they are strong as well. It's just that they're not in our league in that sense. I would also say that one of the things that New Zealand beats Australia is around the connection to official statistics in public and higher education. People like Mike Camden in New Zealand, together with University of Auckland, has done a tremendous job with the Statistical Society of New Zealand as well to bring statistics into the curriculum and using the census as one of the things that kids in New Zealand use very frequently, together with our packages such as Insight and so on. So they're really impressive in that sense. That's a hard job though to do, but it's something that New Zealand is good. Next slide, please. So what can we pick up? Well, as I mentioned, I think that comprehensive statistics curriculum in the basic schools level is something we can learn from New Zealand. It's a hard job to get in there, but I think it might be worth it in the long run because it's really helping users in the future as well to understand the statistics that we do. The second one there is more around using the existing data more, both in the survey setting, but also in the population census for statistics and as auxiliary information. I mentioned at the beginning the register systems in Sweden and Norway. They have information from other agency, the legislation, an agency that picks up unemployed. You need to register there. That is fed into the estimation systems and they can be used. Our single touch payroll that we got here recently, those data exist as well in the Scandinavian countries. And we can actually just look at what they're doing with their data. The Norwegian even have a monthly indicator with hours worked. And when I was in Norway, we used machine learning to impute into that specific register. And hours work is one of these things that makes it, the lack of hours work makes it hard to fulfill all the needs of the national accounts. But it's definitely, you know, there are data out there, and we can use it a lot more, and we are on our way doing it in the current methodology project program as well. I also want to add analytics capability, and this is more of a thought I have. I think the survey paradigm kind of emphasizes time by time thinking. It doesn't necessarily, unless you design it, have a longitudinal part of it. And when you have admin data and registers, you can get those things in there much easier. And I think researchers and policymakers, they really want to analyze, if not cause and effect, at least to see the relationship between things. They want to connect health to wealth and other kinds of things. And this is something that social surveys, in particular, or surveys, have a hard time picking up. And in the Scandinavian countries, there are these databases that actually enhances this ability. And I think with our data integration environment, as I mentioned, MADIP and BLADE, and also on the geospatial part, we can actually get somewhere there. The last thing I like to add, and here's where the Cambodian thing comes in, and Cambodia, Norway, and Stats New Zealand. I think that not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good is another one thing I think we can learn, because that would make us come out with things much quicker. I think I'll round up there, and I think that just to say, the way we have set up our work program in methodology this year, we'll pick up a number of these things, and much thanks to previous work that has been done, but we will concentrate a lot of work on the new data sources. We will look at supporting those new data sources to make them part of the production and make them natural in our environment. We will continue to support and improve things in data collection, for example, which is something that would make our current survey systems more efficient and cost efficient. And we will also look into new methodologies and techniques to pick up things like machine learning, improving our processing and other parts. And I think I'll stop there with just another reflection on Cam Foreman. And I was wondering, it's hard to say what he would have thought about the current situation in official statistics and our work program, but I do think that reading what Ken Brewer wrote about him, he really was somebody who encouraged development and was ready to accept new ideas. And that thing I said about the paper in 1963 kind of proves that. I think that to me personally, getting the contact with Ken Brewer about that paper closes the circle for me to Ken Foreman too. And I think he would be a person that would be willing to listen to some of these new things that we're trying with, let's say, data that are not designed for surveys. I think that wraps it up, and time for discussions and questions if we have some.